It is the mother church of the other Catholic churches, or the other Portuguese Catholic churches in New Bedford. We are the mother church of the other churches because we were first established there in 1871.
In the 1800s, New Bedford was the whaling capital of the world. Many ships left each day on long journeys in search of whales. They often stopped at islands including Cape Verde, Madeira, or the Azores for supplies. Sometimes men from these islands, already experienced in whaling, would join the crew, hoping to see if the many stories about prosperity in the U.S. were true.
The Portuguese first came to New Bedford, and prior to the 1800s. It has been documented that they came aboard some whaling vessels. If you threw a bottle out into the ocean currents and waves will automatically take something from here to the Azores. So that would be your natural first port of call for any vessel leaving this area. So American whaling ships leaving, especially the port of New Bedford, would start their voyage, and if they had men on board that they no longer wanted to be on board, they needed recruits, they needed provisioning, they would stop at the Azores. So therefore they could get men from the islands to join the whaling vessels and join the voyage. Of course, they would not go back to the Azores at the end of the voyage. They would return here to New Bedford. So thereby starting the population here in New Bedford.
By the 1860s, there was a significant enough community of Portuguese here in New Bedford that the Portuguese Catholics, who were in the vast majority of the Portuguese presence here in the city, were worshiping at the one Catholic parish that New Bedford had at the time. It was called St. Mary's Catholic Church. It was located in our present downtown area.
In 1967, there were at least 800 Portuguese in the parish of St. Mary's, and at that point the Catholic Church felt they needed to have their own pastor come and take care of their pastoral needs.
He wanted to be able to provide for them a catechetical instruction, a homiletic instruction, and day-to-day instruction and pastoral service in Portuguese.
My grandparents were Portuguese, and even though they did speak some English, most of their language at home was spoken in Portuguese. So in order for them to understand the homilies and the different other religious services that were at the church, they were in their language and they could understand them. Although they probably could understand some English, it was beneficial if they went to a Portuguese church where the language was spoken so that they could understand what was said. That's very important.
They had a structure. They were using the old St. Mary's structure because by that point St. Mary's had morphed into St. Lawrence Church up on County Street. The church had been built. The chapel was finished in 1868-69 and the church opened a couple of years later so that they were allowed to use the old building that St. Mary's had used at that point. So even though they didn't have their own purpose-built structure, it was still a church that they were using.
The church was the center of the family. The center of life was at the church. The church meant everything to our grandparents and our parents.
The religious aspect of the Portuguese community is extremely important to them. When you go back to the Azores and you look at all the folkloric festivals and all the religious related festivals in the churches there, it certainly then came across the ocean and came to New Bedford. You will see, St. John's, you have festivals there, you have at Mount Carmel. Certainly in the Madeirans, you have the Essa Sacrament, the big Madeiran feast that still goes on. So all of those traditions, and you see even all the smaller churches all have their religious feasts and festivals. The parading of the statues through the street, the homages to the promises they made if they had a successful year.
When the first Portuguese church was established in 1871, which is 141 years ago, they brought a priest over from Portugal to administer at the church because they did not have a Portuguese priest locally that could serve them. So they brought the priest from Portugal to the United States, to New Bedford, Massachusetts, to establish the first Portuguese Catholic church not only in the United States, but in North America, including Canada and Mexico.
And so the Archbishop of Boston communicated with the bishop of the Diocese of the 9 Islands of the Azores. And on January 6th of 1869, the first Portuguese priest arrived in the United States, here in New Bedford. His name was Father João Inácio de Azevedo Encarnação. He was a relatively young man, had been a priest only for a few years. He was a native of the island of Picu. By 1871, there were enough Portuguese Catholics here in New Bedford, and he had worked with them sufficiently that they'd organized themselves, that they petitioned the Archbishop of Boston for the permission to establish a Catholic parish for the service of the Portuguese Catholics. We know some early information about him because he chronicled it when he returned to Portugal in a series of newspaper articles. And he mentions that in those first couple of years, he was able to establish a men's society, a woman's sodality, a parish choir. He was able to begin, in those days, what would have been called catechism, faith formation, religious instruction for the children. And of course, they were able to organize social events in order to provide them with the financial resources, first of all, to build the church, and then secondly, to maintain it. And certainly through all the 141 years of St. John the Baptist Parish, it has been the parishioners, the men and women of the parish, who have sustained it, maintained it with their human resources, with their ability to serve others in the spirit of the gospel, and also, of course, with their sacrificial financial resources that were able to construct the buildings and maintain them.
Our grandparents came over from Portugal, and when they came to New Bedford, this was the church that was established there and the church that they went to all the time.
They were able to find land on the corner of Wing and 5th Streets, and there they constructed the first St. John the Baptist Church. It was a wood construction. They constructed also a house for the priest to reside in it. And it became the center and the locus of the Portuguese community for a number of years.
The church was dedicated on June 27, 1875, the feast day of St. John the Baptist.
My great-grandmother was actually married in that church over 100 years ago, but went back to Portugal. So my family has been here, my immediate family has been here 40-some odd years, 45 years. So, and we've always belonged to St. John's.
With the discovery of petroleum and the decline of whaling, the city turned to the textile industry. Factories were built along the Acushnet River. More workers were needed to work in the mills.
When the warm sun mills first came along in the late 1840s, that gave another industry and another opportunity for employment and people to be able to stay on shore. So you start to see some migration from people working on vessels to working in factories. So we go late 1840s, warm started, 1872, the Potomska mills. And that's when and then after that, the burgeoning of the textile industry in the city. So you get multiple textile companies, multiple areas for people to start working.
The new factories that were looking for help and founded in so many immigrants from Western Europe, from predominantly Catholic countries, so that the Portuguese contributed to the presence of the immigrant workers here in New Bedford at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, along with the Italian and the Polish families, and of course with the Canadians who came from the French-speaking province of Quebec.
To me, I feel it's important for me to belong to a Portuguese parish because it is my culture and something we grew up with, knowing about the Holy Ghost. If we didn't belong to a Portuguese parish, we wouldn't continue that tradition of having the Holy Ghost in our home. That's something that came with our parents from the islands. It's an island thing, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to have people at your house and everyone's praying the rosary together. Everyone gets along and we sing and pray. The family that prays together stays together, is my thought on this.
Faith is lived within our cultures. The Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is to shine in all cultures. And as it shines in a culture, it purifies that culture. It brings out the best in that culture. And people express themselves through their cultural expressions. And they live out their faith. And so in each community of faith, there's a particular chemistry, no matter what the parish is. Even a parish that might only use the English language. Because of who the members are of that community, there's a uniqueness to it, while at the same time maintaining a fidelity to what's common and essential to our universal Catholic faith. In the spring of 1908, there was a significant fire in the original St. John the Baptist Church. And at that time, the community had been growing enough that the parish was actually looking for new land. And so when the fire came and the decision was made that it was not possible to rebuild their church and that they needed a larger structure, the land was purchased here on the corner of County, Allen, and Wing Street. And they began to gather the money to be able to build a new church and a new rectory, a residence for the priests.
The new church was to be constructed in granite quarried from a ledge near Hathaway Road in New Bedford and have a seating capacity of 1,000. It was designed by the firm of Kirchmeier and Mortensen of West Cambridge, Massachusetts. The architect was Matthew Sullivan, who was known for his ecclesiastical architecture throughout Massachusetts.
It's built in very typical Roman Catholic church architecture. It's cruciform. And it provided at that time for the sanctuary, for 2 side altars, and for about 900 people seated in the main church. There was also in this church a small balcony space which was accessed, or is accessed, from the side entrance, the Wing Street entrance. This small room was constructed because at the time of the building of the church, there were a community of religious sisters here in New Bedford. And these sisters, the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary, came to New Bedford in 1906. They came specifically to work with the Portuguese Catholics. And they were a semi-cloistered community of sisters, which meant that though they had an active apostolate, an active ministry, a part of their life was rather removed from ordinary day-to-day activities. And so these sisters would assist at Mass here in the church using the smaller space that would have separated them from the regular community. Also in that side entrance, in the original design, was to have been built a tower, which would have provided for bells. We don't know why, but probably for economic reasons, the tower was never built. And so St. John's, the structure itself, though it's impressive and large, does not have a tower. The churches were built for the type of liturgy, the type of prayer life that would have been existent at the time of its construction in the 1909 to 1913 period. And so the 2 main, the largest sections of pews facing the sanctuary, and then in the transept, 2 other sets of pews, which also one can see the main altar and see the main sanctuary, but they would be also directly in front of 2 side altars, as they remain so today.
The stained glass windows were donated by parishioners to embellish their new house of worship. The windows portray the baptism of Christ by St. John the Baptist, the Annunciation, the Nativity, Mary and Christ giving the rosary to St. Dominic, the presentation in the temple, and the finding of Christ in the temple. The large painting of the Last Supper on the north side of the sanctuary and the artist's rendering of the Sermon on the Mount on the south side were also given to the church by parishioners in memory of loved ones.
There was a huge influx right before World War I of people from the continent. So that's where you see a lot of the fishing industry coming up with the Portuguese influence and the Portuguese going out to fish. They had been fishing on the mainland continent, and they came here, and obviously they went to work in the mills also as another way of earning living. And certainly the women could go and work in the mills, so maybe the men were out fishing and the women were working in the mills, or both were working in the mills.
When they built this church, it was a much larger building, and it did include a parish hall under the actual church, which was used for social functions and for other outreach into the community.
The church opened to the public on May 30th, 1913. A celebration began with 7 a.m. Mass at the old church, followed by a day-long series of activities, and ended with Vespers at the new church.
St. John's is the center of County Street there. It's an essential part of County and Wing Street.
Most people in New Bedford know about St. John's Church because of the locality and the effort that we've always made in establishing our different functions, our feasts, our dinners, our entertainment, and our religion. Our religious services at St. John's are very essential to our family life.
Just about the time of the outbreak of World War I and the culmination of it, there started to be more anti-immigration feelings in the United States. And you started to see laws and legislation passed by the U.S. government limiting access for foreigners into the United States. So the big act was in 1924, really creating the quota system, therefore officially closing the doors to the United States. At that point, only 440 Portuguese were allowed into the United States at that point. But you have to think about it was Azores, it was Madeira, it was Cape Verde, it was mainland Portugal, it was Timor, it was Angola. It was any Portuguese-speaking country at that time was part of that 440 quota. So when you, obviously in Brazil, I mean, obviously you're not going to see as many people from those areas coming to the United States, but it certainly put a cap on it. In looking at some of the immigration records from the consulate here in New Bedford, we also saw that there was a little bit of a way around it. They called them the cartas de chamada, where a family member was here, went to the consulate, said that they would sponsor a person to come and that they would take care of all their needs, etc. So a few more, I think, beyond that quota were able to come in, but it was pretty much closed at that point.
In 1925, the Franciscan sisters purchased and renovated a house at 378 County Street. They were now able to hold free summer sessions for girls ages 6 to 16. This was the beginning of Catholic school education offered by St. John the Baptist Church.
Catholic education, of course, was a very important ingredient in American Catholic life. Particularly in the 19th century, the bishops of the United States made a very strong commitment to providing Catholic education. And it was possible because there was a growing number of women's religious communities who were dedicating themselves to the teaching ministry. And the bishops in the United States were very open about the fact that they had a high expectation that all Catholic parishes would sponsor a Catholic school. And in some places, actually, in the country, particularly here on the East Coast, the Catholic school was built before the actual Catholic Church was built. Or oftentimes, as in here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the school and the church would have been built at the same time using the same building. On one floor having a Catholic school and on the other floor having the church. St. John the Baptist Parish had this dream also of providing Catholic education to the children of their parishioners, to the immigrant children, and providing a good, solid education so that the children would grow up to become patriotic citizens of the United States and also faithful Catholics. And so St. John the Baptist Parish in the 1930s did open a Catholic school. They purchased what we know today as the Grinnell Estate on County Street and created St. John's Academy.
Classes were first held temporarily in what had been the stable of the Grinnell Estate. They began on September 8, 1941, with 16 students. By the end of the first year, attendance had doubled. Renovations on the estate were completed in 1942, and the dedication of the new school, St. John's Academy, took place on September 6th. 1948 was a banner year for the Academy. On June 24th, the first parochial school graduation exercises were held.
And in the 1950s, the parish had the aspiration of building a proper school building, and not just adapting the Grinnell estate, which they had been doing for over 20 years. And in 1957, the cornerstone was laid on Orchard Street for the present-day St. James St. John School. In 1957, it was being built by this parish of St. John the Baptist, and it functioned as a parochial school of St. John the Baptist until the early 1970s, when changing demographics and changing situations among the religious congregations of women necessitated a restructuring of Catholic education. And that restructuring here in the south end of New Bedford brought together two Catholic schools. The one that was sponsored by St. John the Baptist Parish and the one that was sponsored by the former St. James Parish. Those two schools came together. Both of them had as their instructors the Religious Sisters of Mercy in the early 70s. And the school was then given the name St. James St. John. Initially, the school functioned in what was the St. James Parish School building. And then probably about close to 25 years ago, it returned to the newer structure on Orchard Street, where today it still functions as a pre-K through grade 8 school.
During the 1930s and 1940s, activities at the church began to increase. The parish organized the first Catholic Boy Scout troop in New Bedford in 1936.
I started out when I was roughly 7 or 8 years old as an altar boy, and I served as an altar boy probably for 5 years there under Father Salvador, who was the pastor at that time. And going up through the ranks, I also became a member. We had a Boy Scout Troop 17 that was very active in the city, and we attended all the jamborees and the camporees that we had, going down to Miles Standish as Troop 17 from St. John's the Baptist Church. I've always been active in the church, and in 1941, I met my fiancée, who was also a member of St. John's Church. And we used to attend, in those days, the Bible classes on Friday evenings. And we started dating and going out together. And then in 1943, I entered the military service, and I was away for roughly 2.5 years. But when I returned from active duty in Europe, in France and Germany, we picked up again and started dating. And then in 1947, we got married at St. John the Baptist Church. We've been married these years. We've had 5 children who also attended St. John's in catechism classes. They received all their sacraments there at St. John's. And roughly speaking, St. John's has been my life and my wife's life for all these years.
I believe my parents think that they're continuing, the church has continued the culture that was brought from Portugal. Because without the church, we wouldn't have, a lot of the Portuguese culture is religious events. That's what they had when they were in Portugal. Most of their whole life centered around the church. And that's how I was brought up here, was the church was the center of our lives.
So in September of 1957, there was a volcanic eruption on the island of Fayal at the end of the island called Capelinos, where there was a lighthouse. There's still the remnants of that lighthouse. And for a year, throughout that next year, there was still tremors, there was still destruction. It was very much a huge devastation. Senator Kennedy and Senator Pastore managed to pass legislation in 1958, the Azorean Refugee Act, to allow those that were affected by that earthquake and volcanic activity to come to the United States. 4,500 people came in that 1 year, right after that passage of that act. So we have this huge, what we call field-length population that came in, but immigration regulations started to begin to relax. So by 1965, there was the McCarran-Walter Act that then really reopened the doors to immigration for all communities.
Growing up in St. John's was a lot of fun. We'd have catechism on Sunday mornings, so the kids' mass was, I think at the time it was at 9 o'clock. It was either 9 or 9:30. We'd go to mass for the children's mass, and then we'd walk over to catechism. While we were in catechism, it was the Portuguese mass at 11 o'clock, I believe at that time, 11 or 11:30. And by that time, we're getting out of catechism, we'd stop at the corner store, get candy, sit on the church steps, and wait for our parents to leave mass at 12 o'clock or 12:30. And then we'd go home and we'd have our dinner.
As a child, the family still went to St. John's. So there was, at least my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, and I, there would be 4 generations walking in the door of St. John's. I mean, obviously, as time progresses, family members die out, church-going doesn't quite stay the same, even in my family. But there was certainly that longevity of always belonging to that church.
The different waves of immigrants brought folks at different times with different expectations, with different gifts to contribute. And as the older immigrant groups acculturated, some of them remained with the Portuguese Catholic parishes, others moved on, moved either out of the city and joined other Catholic parishes, or just moved in the city. Some, as they moved away from their roots, moving into the 2nd and 3rd generation, maybe didn't speak the language anymore, certainly didn't have to receive religious services in Portuguese, or maybe because of their children, where they'd placed them in school or whatever, they move away from the Portuguese ethnic communities. In these Portuguese ethnic communities, as here at St. John's, there are some people who are not of Portuguese descent. But those few folks who are parishioners, it's probably because they've married a Portuguese-American person. And they too bring an appreciation of the Portuguese culture, but also they bring the gifts of their own ethnic background to enrich the community. Today, in 2012, there's been no significant immigration from Portugal for almost 20 years. The first generation of Portuguese Catholics are aging very rapidly. And as they age and as they die, the 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation, some remain connected to the parish. So there are people here who were born and received all the sacraments, have continuously been parishioners here. And some of those families, a good number of them, their children no longer belong. They've gone to other parts of the area or moved out of state, of course. Parishes are dynamic communities. They're not static communities. They're growing and living and changing communities of people.
On November 4th, 2012, the final Mass was held in St. John the Baptist Church.
What I like about St. John's is that we people at St. John's live like a natural family. It's not a sophisticated parishioner church. We are family, we know everyone, we get along with everyone, we make it, the people there make it a happy family church where you're comfortable there. You're as comfortable in St. John's Church as you are in your living room, because the people make it so. The church itself doesn't make it so. It's the people that go there, the families that go there every week and attend Mass and other religious services that make the parish what it is today and what it was years ago.